football assignment, we're going to use polymorphism and abstraction to keep track of players in a fantasy football game and the scores that they attain based on their score in the real NFL games of that week. We're also going to use a Visual Basic input box to gather input from the user. So we're going to create a base class or a parent class called player. It's going to keep track of the first name, the last name, and the team. We'll also provide the full name as a return string. And it's going to have some abstracted methods of calculate score, roster, and player score. Then we'll have a class for each of the types of players, a quarterback, and we'll calculate their score, a running back, a wide receiver, a tight end, and a kicker. And I give you some test data that you can use to test your scores. In this project, I provide a zip of the Form 1, and your job then is simply to create the classes that accompany that Form 1 and the C# score of that Form 1. Now you may know nothing about fantasy football, or even nothing about American football or National Football League, on which this is based, and that's okay. Oftentimes we have to produce software that we are not necessarily conversant in the topic that we're producing for. And we can gather information from our client, from doing research, or we might hire what's called a subject matter expert, or a SME, who can inform us about how football is played and how scores are done. Fantasy football involves people coming together in a social event and doing a draft of players from the National Football League, with each team creating a roster of players of a certain number of quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, and kickers. Each week they evaluate the games that are going to be played that week and decide which players they will play in the competition against another team. So each week we're going to play a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, and a kicker. And how each of those players score in that week's matchup in the regular NFL games determines the score for each of the players in the Fantasy Football League. A quarterback can get 6 points for a touchdown, a point for every 40 yards passing, a point for 20 yards rushing, but will lose 3 points for each interception thrown. A running back will score 6 points for each touchdown, a point for combined yards, every 20 combined yards of rushing and receiving, but a minus 4 points for each fumble lost, but they'll get 5-point bonus if they rush for 100 yards or more. A wide receiver receives 6 points for each touchdown, a point for each reception, and a point for every 20 yards receiving, but again a minus 4 points for each fumble lost. The tight end scoring is the same as the wide receiver, and then a kicker scores 3 points for each field goal and a point for each extra point. In the modules of our Canvas course, are the instructions for the fantasy football assignment. And here's the project you'll download and unzip. It contains the Form 1 and all the code behind it, and you're going to add in the player class and then the derived inherited classes that use the abstraction methods we've talked about. There's also a document here on how to use the VB input box as a PDF, and you can open that and follow the instructions on how to incorporate Visual Basic's input box methods. Well, let's take a look at the project running. So we have a form here with a list box that the font is set to Courier News, so everything lines up nicely in the columns. We have a button to clear the roster, but here we're going to add a quarterback. So each week we play 1 quarterback. And this is the Visual Basic input box that is being brought up. It allows a string entry. So we want to put in the last name. I'm going to use the data that's provided in the instructions, Marino, Dan, and Miami as the team abbreviation, and so that then adds it to our list box. We're going to add a running back, and Marcus Allen is Oakland. We'll add a second running back, Walter Payton is from Chicago. Now I'm going to add 2 wide receivers, Jerry Rice of San Francisco, Chris Carter of the Minnesota Vikings. Our tight end, will be Shannon Sharp of Denver. And then finally our kicker, Morton Anderson of Atlanta. So there's the players we're playing this week. Now the Sunday games would take place, and we'd have to go in and add the scores for each of these players. So we can click on a player in the list box, and it's going to ask us to enter the number of TDs for the quarterback, the passing yards, the rushing yards, and the interceptions. So the data I gave in the instructions was three touchdowns, 345 yards passing, 31 yards rushing, and 1 interception. And click OK or press return. It's going to show me the total points that player scored and then the details. So again, we get 6 points for each touchdown, a point for every 40 yards passing, a point for every 31 yards rushing, and then a minus 3 points for an interception. Let's add in our running back scores. So here again, we're going to touchdowns, rushing yards, receiving yards, and fumbles. So Marcus Allen scored 7 points. The total yards here are 151 yards. Dividing that by 20 gives us 7 points. Again, we're doing an integer division. Walter Payton, 3 touchdowns, 145 yards, 42 receiving yards, and 1 fumble lost. That's 28 points. 6 for the touchdowns. The combined yardage here of 187 can give him another 9. He gets a 5-point bonus for rushing for over 100 yards, but loses 4 points for a fumble. Down here in the bottom, you see team scores being totaled as we go along here. Jerry Rice scores 19 points. Chris Carter another 14 points. Shannon Sharp gets a total of 8 points. And finally, Morton Anderson had 2 field goals and 3 extra points for a total of 9 points. And our team score is 109. I suggest at this point that you pause the video here, try to write the player class and the derived inherited classes from that using the abstraction methods for quarterback, running back, tight end, wide receiver, and kicker. And if you have problems, then come back and watch the remaining part of this video in which I'll walk you through my code. Here's the starting project with the Form 1 and the various buttons to add the players, and then the list box in which we can click on each player in the list and add in their scores. Let's just very quickly take a look at the code for that Form 1. And so a class level variable, basically an array for the players of type player. So it's going to be our player class. So when you open this up, you're going to get a little squiggly under there because player has not yet been created. You'll get a bunch of errors when you open up the starting form because we don't have player, we don't have quarterback, we don't have wide receiver classes, and so forth. When we load the form, we're going to create a string for our different columns, and we'll call that SF. I'm going to create a header going across of position, team, name, points, and details. Here's the code for clearing the roster, code for adding the quarterback, and here's where we're going to use that Microsoft Visual Basic InputBox method, which we need to add that to our project. Same thing for adding a running back. Some places the name of the team into our player array and adds it to the list box. Wide receiver, tight end, and kicker. And then when we click on each of the items in that list box, we're going to call calculate score for that player in our roster, and it's going to use the calculate score for whatever type of player that belongs to the class. So we'll use the calculate score for a quarterback if it's a quarterback, calculate score for running back, and so forth. And then it's calculating the team score along the way. Well, so the first task is to create a player class. Here's my player class. So we're going to have some properties for first name, last name, and team. Another property, the full name, which is a read-only, so it's going to get. We're not going to set that. And then our constructor, we're adding in the last name, first name, and team. And then here's our abstract classes that need to be incorporated into our child classes of calculate score, roster, and player score. Notice the abstract keyword here. That's going to force us to create those methods in the derived classes. Let's take a look at the quarterback. So in the quarterback, we're going to add in properties for the touchdowns, the passing yards, the rushing yards, the interceptions, and the points scored. And then our constructor, it's going to accept the last name, first name, and team parameters and use the base of our player class to create the instance. We're setting all of the other properties to 0 at this point. Here's our method to calculate the score. And again, we're going to use the input box and ask them to enter the TDs, passing yards, rushing yards, interceptions. And since this is cut off, let me just add this over. Enter the game stats for, it's going to be our title with the full name, and then we're going to show just some zeros in a string so visually they can see how many items they need to enter. We're going to split the input on the comma and parse those out as integers, and then each of those items in the XYZ data array that's been created from split, we're going to set up the passing yards, the rushing yards, the interceptions, and then calculate the points scored. For roster, this is when we're adding the player to the list box. We're simply going to format QB as a literal string, the team, and their first and last name. And then here's our override string for the player score. We're going to provide the details in a concatenated string, set up our string format, and then return that string using the string format. Again, the quarterback, the team, the first name and last name, and then the points scored and the scoring details. Basically, our running back classes are pretty much going to be exactly the same, with the exception where here we're getting the points scored, touchdowns, receiving yards, rushing yards, and fumbles. Changing our input box a little bit to reflect that. For our roster, we're going to add in the string of running back rather than quarterback, RB. And our player score, we're going to calculate the scoring details and the score a little bit different from the quarterback. We're also adding in a bonus here if the rushing yards are greater than 100. We're going to add in a 100-yard bonus, and then we'll return that string into our list box. For the wide receiver, here we're going to get the touchdowns, receptions, receiving yards, fumbles. For our constructor, for the wide receiver, again, we're going to get last name, first name, team, and pass those to our base or parent class. Calculating the score, again, we're going to use a different input box. Ask these to enter the touchdowns, receptions, receiving yards, and fumbles. We're going to split those in the comma and add that information into our instance. Roster, again, we're going to specify WR as our position, and then the player score, pretty much the same thing. We're just going to get the scoring details, create a formatting string, and then return that to our list box. The tight ends are really exactly the same. The only difference between it and the wide receivers is we're going to specify tight end rather than wide receiver in all these different locations. And then finally our kicker. Here we're going to get the field goals and the extra points and calculate the points scored. For our Visual Basic input box, we're just asking for field goals and extra points. Our roster, we're going to show a K for the position, and then here's our player score, creating a concatenated string for the scoring details, and then returning that as a formatted string to our list box. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the C# Xamarin Programming Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.